Hello and welcome to Eighth House Portal. Today I wanted to dive into the topic of prenuptial agreements. That is definitely an Eighth House topic, shared resources. But first, I want to start with a story about Jonathan. Jonathan was in his early 30s when he met her. He had spent most of his 20s building something out of nothing, a small tech company that had finally begun to stabilize. It wasn't flashy, but it was his. Years of risk, long nights, uncertain income. It represented more than money. It was part of his identity. Then he fell in love. She was thoughtful, steady, creative. She earned less than he did, but she brought emotional intelligence and depth into his life in a way he hadn't expected before. They talked about building a home together, children, a future that felt shared and expansive. For the first time, Jonathan wasn't thinking about survival. He was thinking about partnership. A few months before the wedding, his parents raised something practical. "Have you thought about a prenup?" They didn't say it harshly, they said it carefully. "You've worked hard. Protect what you've built." Jonathan felt the tension immediately. He didn't want love to feel like a transaction. He didn't want her to feel measured against assets. But he also knew the company wasn't just his anymore. Investors were involved. It wasn't just romance, it was responsibility. When he brought it up to her, the air changed. Not because she wanted his money, but because the question felt like doubt. "Are you planning for this to end?" she asked. He tried to explain it. It wasn't about ending, it was about structure, about clarity, about protecting both of them from chaos if something unimaginable happened. They decided to speak to lawyers. The draft agreement outlined that anything built before the marriage would remain separate. Assets built together would be shared. If she chose to pause her career for children, provisions would protect her. The business would remain shielded from disruption. What surprised them wasn't the legal language, it was the conversations that came after. They had to discuss scenarios that had never been something they wanted to imagine. For the first time, they were looking at the end before they had even begun. And something subtle shifted. They realized marriage wasn't just about love. It was about merging risk, merging futures, vulnerability, and power. Money wasn't separate from intimacy. It was woven into it. The prenup didn't feel romantic, but the honesty did. And here is where the story splits. In one version, the clarity strengthens them. Nothing is assumed, nothing is hidden. Security is mutual. The contract becomes quiet background structure, not fear, but architecture. In another version, the negotiations reveal deeper fractures, different beliefs about sacrifice, different expectations about control. The prenup doesn't destroy the relationship, it exposes it. Jonathan eventually understood something. The document itself wasn't the real issue. The real issue was this. Is love stronger when we pretend nothing could go wrong? Or when we acknowledge that everything human is vulnerable and choose each other anyway? A prenup is not just a legal contract. It's a moment where romance meets reality, where trust meets risk, where love meets power. And what it reveals depends entirely on the integrity of the people signing it. So here's a question I have. If you truly trusted someone, would you still sign a contract to protect yourself from them? I think we first need to look at what a prenuptial agreement is, or another term for it would be a marriage contract. So if we look at the Cambridge Dictionary definition, a A prenuptial agreement is an official document signed by two people before they get married that says what will happen to their possessions and or children if they divorce, meaning officially not being married anymore. Many of us don't think about signing a contract like this when we are in the midst of planning our wedding or our lives together. But I feel like it's definitely a topic that's coming up and becoming more common. Like it said in the definition, they basically enforce how assets or debts are handled in the event that there's a divorce or a death. And things that are commonly addressed in these contracts are property division, business interests, premarital assets. And if they are not drafted properly, the courts can invalidate them, especially if one side shows unfairness. You have to also remember when you're getting a contract like this drafted, if it's not drafted properly, meaning it means that it may not be enforceable, they have to meet strict procedural standards to be enforceable. So, for example, if in regards to it not being drafted properly, if there's a lack of full financial disclosure, so financial statements aren't attached, or there's missing major assets like foreign property or trust, or there's vague language used, that can invalidate that document. Or another thing would be if the couple didn't get independent legal advice, ILA. So each party should receive independent legal advice before signing anything. Another thing would be if you're signing something under duress, pressure, right? The agreement has to be entered voluntarily. You can't be signing things like this days before the wedding. Okay, that puts somebody under immense pressure. Because think about it, you've already paid for the wedding, everybody's invited, they're all coming. Of course, you're going to probably sign it. Another one would be grossly unfair terms. So, for example, I remember hearing a story, I think it was a radio show, and I guess there was a man that made the woman he was going to marry sign a prenuptial agreement before their wedding. I think it was before their wedding. Must have been maybe days or weeks before their wedding. And part of that contract stated that she has to maintain her weight. I don't know if anybody's heard of this case. And I'm not sure if she had children or she did gain some weight, but during the marriage she did gain weight, and he was able to bring up that in the courts. To be honest, I can't remember the outcome of that, but that is extremely unfair, especially if a woman has had a child. I mean, you're also being forced to sign it days before a wedding, right? So, of course, you're going to sign it. Everybody's invited. Everything's paid for. But something like that is extremely unfair. Another example of something being grossly unfair is when one spouse waives all property rights and support without any compensation. Another one would be violating statutory rights. So, for example, child support. You cannot override child support obligations. It's the law. You have to pay it. And then, of course, there's ambiguity. So if you've got vague language, undefined terms, or failure to address things like future growth of assets, so like property owned before the marriage. So look, here's an example. If somebody writes in their contract, all property owned before marriage shall remain the property of the original owner, it doesn't define the property. Like, is it an investment? Is it crypto? It doesn't address growth value. It doesn't specify the treatment of matrimonial home. And if you don't attach any financial schedules, this can be invalidated. It's funny, it brings to mind, just popped into my mind, Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. I believe she was with him for around 20 years they were married, and multiple pregnancies. Unfortunately, she lost most of those children and only had Mary in the end. But Henry sought annulment after about 20 years of being married to Catherine of Aragon, and then exiled her from court, stripped her of her queen status, and also refused to allow her to see her daughter Mary. And Catherine maintained that she was the lawful queen until her death. So, I mean, that's extremely unfair. I mean, we also understand King Henry VIII's reasons, right? He wanted an heir. But, I mean, that's just something that popped in my head for some reason. But that's extremely unfair. So what is an annulment? Because I'm still on Henry VIII here. An annulment is an official announcement that something such as a law or an agreement or a marriage no longer exists. But back to present time, does discussing a prenup strengthen communication? Or does it introduce anxiety? Is there a fear of confronting reality? We have different types of attachment patterns. There's anxiously attached partners that may perceive prenups as rejection. Then there's avoidantly attached partners who may favor them for independence. And then you've got the securely attached couples that just see it as something very practical that needs to get done. This is where sometimes we have to look at what some of the research shows. So according to research in adult attachment theory, not all people experience intimacy the same way. Some adults fall into what is called attachment security. Some people are more secure, some are more anxious about abandonment, and some are more avoidant of dependence. So if a person is more anxious in relationships, a prenuptial agreement might feel like a signal that bond is fragile, like creating emotional distance before marriage even happens. If someone is more avoidant, a prenup can feel stabilizing for them because it feels like they are preserving their autonomy. And if you have someone who is secure, well, a prenup can just feel like something practical, right? Instead of a threat. So attachment theory reminds us that sometimes our reactions to something like a prenup often says a lot about our relational patterns more than the actual contract itself. Another research paper also illustrates how couples remember their shared experiences differently. There's a good study here. It's called Commitment in Romantic Relationships as a Function of Partners' Encoding of Important Couple-Related Memories. And that's by Valerie Gubolt and Frederick Philippe. I'll also put a link to that if anyone's interested. But they found that partners emotionally encode important relationship memories, like when they felt valued, respected, or connected, etc. So commitment isn't just built on what happens, but also on how we interpret what happens. So when the topic of getting a prenup comes up, one partner might experience it as protection and mutual care. But if the other encodes the same moment as rejection or mistrust, it may weaken emotional security. The emotional memory of the conversation about it becomes a part of the relationship story then. What happens when there is a breakup in a relationship? When we go into the economic reality of things. During a marriage, one parent may have stayed at home. They may have stopped their career to take care of children. You know, that's one example of something that could have changed over the course of marriage. But when you finally get divorced, there's a greater long-term economic impact on women, especially those who stopped their careers for caregiving. So getting a marriage contract or agreement, it can protect wealth, but it can also potentially be a disadvantage to the partner that has a lower income. if those contracts are poorly structured. And here's a question: who benefits most from a prenup? There has been divorce research that illustrates shifts in well being for adults and children, particularly women with children, and an increase in economic hardship after separation. And some of that information you can find in the Journal of Marriage and Family. It's called Research on Divorce Continuing Trends and New Developments by Paul Amato. Far too often, I've heard and seen when couples go through a divorce, the man in that relationship, for some reason, wants to sever ties or financial obligations, not just to his previous wife, but his own children. I mean, how many of us have seen or heard stories like that? And it leaves the woman in that previous relationship, whether they have children or not, it leaves that woman in a position where they have to, only if they have the courage and financial backing, because getting a lawyer is very expensive. If they're able to do that, to get a lawyer and take their ex-spouse to court, they can possibly get a judge to rule and make an order that that spouse has to pay child support. But those women that don't have the money or the courage to even do that, they get zero help, and they are on their own. Not just trying to bring their own life back, but support their children and make sure they're safe and taken care of. On the other hand, I have seen certain individuals, certain men. There's one in particular. I'm not going to say his name, but he was married at one point, and that didn't last. She was very young. She was much younger than he was, but we all were just happy for him. I think people that watched him and followed him, we were just happy that he had somebody in his life that he was looking for. They ended up breaking that marriage off, and it was very interesting to watch how he took care of her during that transition. He paid her rent until she figured things out. He made sure her car was paid off. I mean, I was blown away. I thought, wow, if every man could do that. And then there's another example. I remember watching, I can't remember which Housewives episode it was. It was long ago, and I don't know if this is just maybe men that maybe are more wealthy, but I remember one of the Housewives episodes where the man, I believe he had been seeing somebody else. So the end of that marriage was due to him having an affair, but he made sure that his wife or his ex-wife was being taken care of. He helped her get, I guess, her own business together. He took care of her. So my point is that there are men out there who can operate from a strong sense of responsibility, integrity, dignity and honor. Men who ensure their former partners are financially stable during transition. And it's not because they think it's required, but they believe it is right, and it shows their character. So marriage isn't just emotional, it's energetic, and it's a merging of energy. And historically, it's been seen as a financial alliance or a property arrangement or a lineage contract. So for most of history, marriage was never just purely romantic. It was economic. It was an economic structure first, and then a love story second. So when two people marry, they are not just sharing affection, they are merging future or risk, debt, and potential loss. A prenup asks us to look at the end before we have even begun. So here's a question for those listening. Is love stronger when we ignore impermanence or when we acknowledge it? Is there an emphasis on conscious union, or is it more of a naive union? If you were entering marriage tomorrow, what would feel more loving? Blind trust or transparent agreement? honestly and personally, I'm in the middle. I can see both sides of this issue. And that might tell you a bit about my attachment style, but I feel like it all comes down to communication. If you're not talking to your partner, if you're not communicating, if you're not sharing the way you're supposed to, of course it's going to lead to issues. And then it's going to lead to a divorce. It's going to lead to thousands of dollars on lawyers who, I'm sorry, lawyers, if you're listening, but the back and forth and making money from people with the back and forth is ridiculous. But you don't know until you're in it, right? You don't know. I mean, you think you're marrying somebody you know, and then what happens down the road where they start changing? They're not the person you thought they were. What are you going to do when you realize that you're constantly trying to communicate or get them to communicate and they're just not doing it, or they're hiding things from you financially, right? So in that case, of course you'd want a prenup, right? But at the same time, when you're at the beginning of that relationship, it's about trust, right? Otherwise you wouldn't get married. But again, you don't know. There are some people out there that intentionally have already planned what they're going to do with you. There are bad people. It is what it is. Or maybe you thought you understood the way the other person, thought. And so you trusted them and you didn't create a prenup. Things change over time. That's for sure. And so I can definitely see that contract as protection. I mean, I think one of the best things to do is bring up the topic at some point during dating. At some point, not right at the beginning, at the first date, but maybe, a couple of months in, what exactly does the other person think of a prenuptial agreement? Because there's no point in wasting time with somebody if they're not understanding you. I think communication from the beginning and trust and honesty have to be on the table. It just has to. You just better hope that you've chosen somebody who is honest, because that obviously will become a problem. So I want to say I'm still in the middle of this because I see it from both sides. How can I sign something without? How can that be love if I'm signing a contract like that? But then I also see the other side of it. I definitely see it as protection. I definitely see it as structure in the relationship because you don't know what can come up during your marriage. You have no idea, things you didn't even think of. So I see it from both sides. And I know, especially with some of the experiences I've been through, my goodness, it's probably a good idea, isn't it? But it's definitely something that needs to be talked about long before you even think of getting married to somebody. I think that, honestly, communication is key, that you wouldn't even need to sign something like this. However, not everybody's the same, right? Not everybody's going to see things in the same way or understand it the same way. And so in the end, you probably would have to get something in writing, just to be clear, because there are too many factors that could pop up during marriage that could really change the course of things. And you better hope you've chosen a partner that's ready to work through things, that is clear and honest and knows how to communicate. Are they able to go with you through the journey, through the transformation? Marriage is a vessel, and shared assets can increase pressure, and pressure reveals truth. So, perhaps a prenup is not about planning for failure, but about clarifying the vessel before the fire begins. Until next time, take care.